We are incredibly privileged to have with us Yehuda Kurtzer, the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Much you already know about Yehuda. He is a prolific author and speaker and one of the premier Jewish educators on the organized Jewish landscape. He is the author of multiple books, including Shuva, The Future of the Jewish Past, and more recently is co-editor of the New Jewish Canon, a collection of the most significant Jewish ideas and debates of the last two generations. It is fair to say that Yehuda is one of the leading and guiding lights in the Jewish community and in the Jewish world, and more to the point for us, a longtime friend of the JCC movement and a personal friend with whom I have a treasured relationship. Yehuda, we are thrilled to have you. And before I turn the program and this group of leaders over to you for your opening comments, I just want to offer a word or two about who we are, who we see ourselves as being here. The JCC movement, which comprises 170 JCCs across Canada and the United States, is the largest platform for Jewish engagement on this continent. Pre-COVID, we welcomed more than 1 million Jews through our doors each and every week throughout the year, and they were reflective of every demographic, every background, every corner of Jewish life, from infancy to old age, from ultra-Orthodox to completely secular, left, right, and center politically, and representative of every letter of the identity alphabet. In short, we acknowledge and recognize our primary and fundamental responsibility to be the big tent of the Jewish community, a responsibility that is increasingly challenging to bear in the face of the pandemic and the increasingly polarized nature of our society from a political standpoint. So it is with those things in mind that we have been thrilled to gather this leadership group to hear from you, and that I will have the honor of engaging you in conversation for a period thereafter before we open up to their questions. So Yehuda, with that, I turn the floor over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Doron. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the kind intro. And before I start, I just want to say I have a whole thing about Jewish communal professionals and leaders in the Jewish community not getting thanked enough. So I'm going to use the privilege of opening here to thank you all for your work. I can't imagine, you know, for all of us, this year has been impossible on a personal level, on an existential level. And I'm not just talking about community, which I'm going to do. I'm also a member of a Jewish community, and I also run my own Jewish organization. Our work has all been incredibly hard. I can't imagine what it has been like when the core work of running a JCC involves inviting people into a building and having to keep those buildings closed, to furlough workers, to take furloughs yourself. So I just want to express my gratitude to you for not only doing that work and holding that space over the course of this year, but still being here and working at JCCs at this point in this process. And a number of you may have heard me speak prior to the pandemic about a theme that I've been pushing on in Jewish life for a number of years now, which is that we've been living through, and I think still are, living through a moment of enormous disruption in Jewish communal life well before the pandemic, that I've argued has been a period of revolutionary change in Jewish life that we have miscategorized as evolutionary change. And the costs of that miscategorization, when you treat revolutionary change as evolutionary change, is that you are oftentimes ill-equipped to actually make the conceptual shift in the time that you're living in, and you always feel that you are behind. Many Jewish communal leaders talk about feeling overwhelmed by contemporary trends, and part of the reason for that is because we're thinking too slowly about the pace of change as it's overtaken us in Jewish life. And those three major indexes where those changes have been taking place are in the realm of identity. Who is a Jew? Who's defined as a Jew? What's the difference between a Jew and a non-Jew? The realm of ideology. What are the things that we hold in common? Can we describe something as common Judaism? Can we characterize anything as shared Jewish values anymore? And the third is infrastructure. We as an American Jewish community inherited a communal infrastructure designed to manage the needs of 20th century American Jews. And it's pretty clear to a lot of us that it's not the communal infrastructure that we would design today for the needs of contemporary American Jews. So identity, ideology, and infrastructure, I've usefully alliterated it. When we treat these revolutions as evolutions, we think that all we need to do is make what, business school pundits will talk about as technical changes to keep pace with the trends, as opposed to really adaptive changes of saying, if we are fundamentally serving a totally different Jewish people than the Jewish people were a half century ago, if we are built around a brand of Judaism, which represents a different set of ideas than we ever faced before, and if we have inherited an infrastructure that doesn't work, what will we have to do to actually make radical change? All of that, I think, was true as of March 2020. When we hit the pandemic, I would argue, and I think others are as well, the pandemic is basically, is and going to be a pretty significant accelerant of any major adaptive trends involved in Jewish life, whether it means that they are going to explode now or 3 to 5 years from now, we don't really know. But I think many of us in Jewish community institutions are aware that when you have to suspend what you do and how you do it for a long period of time, you are engaging in a basic essentialist and existential exercise about the nature and importance of what that work is. If you can't do what you were doing beforehand the way you were doing it, you have to ask a question of, how can I still achieve my mission in the world if I can't do it the way I did it before? And as we know, we're going to see a lot of uncertainty in our Jewish communal field. I think some organizations who were well positioned because they had a clear mission orientation of what they were supposed to do, they had a strong network of stakeholders, they had financial security, will have learned from this pandemic a real mission clarity about what they're supposed to achieve in the world, and may come out as a result of it a lot stronger. And many other institutions who are already on the back foot with respect to those questions, simply a year of not doing what you were doing, how you were doing it, will forever alter not only whether that work is important, but whether the community views it as important enough to sustain. That's the topic I want to engage with one other element. If we want to be even to make the other big problematic, is that we as American Jews are not only living through this phase of adaptation around American Jewish identity and ideology and infrastructure as though we are a minority community experiencing all of these stories in a limited way that is particular to our own experience. But we I'm speaking principally as American Jews, though I suspect there are non-American JCCs and communities here. We are also experiencing the same overall trends that Americans are experiencing. And so forces that are not specific to Jewish life, like the forces of partisanship, which is a major existential threat to any notion of community, are other features and forces that are challenging us to hold the notion of community together. I'm interested today in exploring questions of community that are microeconomic. How do I, as the leader of a particular community, what did I learn from this pandemic about my community? I was on a call yesterday, actually, with a bunch of Jewish communal leaders, and I asked them that question. It was an interesting exercise. What did you learn about your particular institutional community this year? But I also want to try to do this a little bit macroeconomically. What do we learn about collective communal infrastructure from this time, and how can we go forward? The first idea I want to share is that I think I want us to lean into the notion that the commitment to community is a radical idea. It's always kind of been a radical idea, even before the Enlightenment and the Emancipation, which move the individual to the forefront as a kind of a political act. Even before that, community is damn hard. It requires belonging to infrastructure where you don't always get to make the rules. It often, and I'll come back to this, demands more of you in terms of obligations and commitments to the collective than you necessarily get as benefits from it. And it requires some amount of suppressing the self, because I believe that I'm going to be able to benefit from belonging to something that's bigger than me. I think it's basically a radical act. At the same time, many of us talk about a lot of, I guess, the most common Jewish social science research in America tends to talk about individualism as a threat to community. I want to suggest I don't think that's really true. What I think has really emerged for many American Jews is that the language of individualism has given us, and I think it's a real gift, has enabled us all as individuals to have the right and the ability to narrate our own identities, to tell our own stories, to determine what we want other people to think about us based on how we think about ourselves, to enumerate our pronouns, to articulate our racial, cultural, ethnic identities in ways that are familiar to us. I think that is an unbelievable and radical change. But that's not the same as being individual, as the notion of an individual, therefore being incapable of living in community. In fact, I think what's lost on a lot of us is that humans have not changed so radically and anthropologically in the span of 100 or 200 years that we don't actually need community. All of us are in and dependent on communities all the time. What has changed for us is that none of us are effectively forced to belong to coercive communities, or fewer of us are forced to belong to coercive communities than at other times in our history. And oftentimes we have the gift of agency in being able to turn that story of narrating my own identity into the right to opt into the communities that I want to belong to. But the extraordinary feature of human life is that all of us belong to communities all the time. And the modern turn is that we get to be free agents in choosing into the communities, opting in, and at times to be able to opt out. In other words, the challenge we face around building Jewish communities and building institutions around Jewish community, which is what I think a JCC is that we no longer can take for granted the notion of belonging coercively. Good news, bad news. None of us want to be in a business of coercing other people to belong to our communities. But the challenge of running any kind of membership-based community is that once upon a time, people kind of had to belong to it. And that made fundraising a lot easier. That made predicting your membership a lot easier. And it also meant that you can manage complaints less because people don't have a choice. What does it look like when people still depend on community? They want what we are selling. They're actually desperate for it on a human level, but there's no longer a coercive mechanism by which they're obligated to belong. Make a couple of comments on what I think we learned from the pandemic, what I think we could watch for, and then Doron, I really am eager to hear your reactions or reflections and to go deeper on some of this. I think we saw a few things on a local level from different communities during this pandemic. For better or worse, the Jewish people have a long history of recognizing that community is forged in crisis and that you learn a lot about your values from moments of crisis. So one thing I think we saw was a kind of global essentialist exercise. What do we have to offer? What do we have to do? What's more important and what's less important? And then are we actually prepared to serve the people on the basis of what's really important and what's less important? And I think I'm sure a lot of you are coming back into your jobs when people are going to re-enter in the building and saying, if I didn't have to do that stuff for a year, do I really need to do it anymore? I think that's an incredibly valuable essentialist exercise on a local level and a national level for the organized Jewish community to say what was really important and what wasn't. Let's just use a local synagogue example, my own synagogue. My own synagogue realized, I think, early on in the pandemic that with many organizations like the Hartman Institute putting more and more free content for adults available online, they didn't need to spend a lot of time or money building their own adult education catalog. In fact, why would they compete? What did people need in my community? They needed a rabbi to visit the sick and to bury the dead, the core things that actually Jewish community has provided for people. And I found that fascinating because it means that the economics of Jewish communal structures can change once we actually clarify what's essential for us to offer and what's redundant for us to offer. And I think that has huge implications for the whole question of national organizations versus local organizations that I'm sure we can talk about. I think we also understood as a result of the pandemic better the culture of obligation as a force that makes community happen. There's no such thing as a Jewish community in which people are not obligated to it. If there's no obligations that drive communal life, communities don't happen. Right? So sometimes your obligation is created by the fact that you're the payroll, right? You're obligated to do it because you're responsible for it. Your name is on the lease. But the truth is, communities are held together by people who have obligations. I wonder what that means for us in thinking about how much our organizations think they have to market to people on the basis of benefits that they get from belonging, as opposed to opportunities to participate in the obligations. And I think a third thing that we learned, that I personally learned, is that community is boundaried. We know this to be true. There's no such thing as a community that has no boundaries. Our Jewish community doesn't like talking about boundaries because sometimes when we do that, we wind up accidentally, or sometimes on purpose, creating boundaries on the basis of socioeconomic class or race or ethnicity or other things that are not necessarily the moral categories. But all communities need some sense of who it's serving and who it's not. My own understanding of community changed in a pandemic when I realized I was more dependent on my next door neighbors than I was on people further away. And that's a really just important realization around what actually is the mechanics that helps communities work. I guess the last piece is, if community as an anthropological need for human beings hasn't really changed, if there are some core truths around belonging, around boundaries, around obligation that have been true for a long time for the Jewish people and for others about community, if we know that this remains important, the bigger challenge we still have is that our people want community. They may not just, it just may be that they don't want community in the communal infrastructure that we happen to have available to us. For instance, like a lot of people observe that, like, on the far left of the Jewish community, in the world of progressive activism, there's an argument made that, like, it's progressive activism on behalf of moral causes as opposed to Jewish community. That is a misread. People who gather together to fight against the occupation are doing so in ways that also are ways of seeking out other people to have Shabbat dinner with. In other words, they are building their own communities. It just may not be a community that is dependent on the infrastructure of the local JCC. What do we do to match up between the availability of physical and conceptual infrastructure in the Jewish community that is created to hold community, and the fact that many people want community in other places and need to build their own infrastructure accordingly? I know that sometimes what communities do is they build out on the basis, they're kind of open plan. I'll give you my space, come in and build something. That's one model. Another market-driven model is, let me try to provide the best things that money can buy in the hope of enticing you into the building. These are really powerfully opposite choices. I don't have a sense, obviously, of what's the better business practice, but I am noticing that they tell really different stories of whether we think community is something to be marketed or community is something to be kind of co-created with the people who are at our disposal. Most of all, what I'm really excited to think about is whether this moment of pandemic, precisely because it surfaces for us all of the tensions around community and reminds us of how important community is, whether it can also be a generative moment, not just to say, how do I get back to business as usual, but what might be the radical move that we say about community that takes us forward. So I have plenty more thoughts and details on this, but let me turn it back to you, Doron, and I'm excited to talk to you.
Yehuda, thank you so much. As always, a lot to think about and a lot of important perspective relative to the way we're interpreting the things that are taking place around us. I want to invite all the folks on the who are part of this program to begin thinking about your questions or comments, and remind you to put them in the chat. Sam is going to curate your questions when we get to that point in our program. Though before that, I'm going to take a few minutes to react a little bit to some of the things, Yehuda, that you said, and to engage with you a little bit. Some of my colleagues get tired of hearing me say that I'm a relative newcomer to the JCC movement. I'm going on my 4th anniversary in this role, so not quite as new as I used to be. But I was drawn to this movement and to this role for a particular reason, because having worked in the organized Jewish community for the last 25 years or more, I have observed a gradual but precipitous decline in the level of participation in Jewish life in the traditional institutions and organizations that constituted what being Jewishly engaged meant when I was growing up. And I grew up here in the New York area. And so in my house, we were members of a conservative synagogue, and my dad was part of the UJA campaign. My mom went to Hadassah meetings, and my dad had his ZOA group that he hung out with, and we went to Young Judea as kids. And in the summers where we were age appropriate, we went to the Y for day camp in Hackensack, New Jersey, the YMYWHA. And as I watched the work of Jewish life and Jewish community in the intervening years, we have seen a steady decline in the level of participation in just about every single one of those frameworks. Some have disappeared altogether. Some are shadows of their former selves. We look at the participation levels in congregational life. The number of people contributing to Jewish Federation campaigns has become just a small fraction of what it used to be. The only address in the Jewish community that has not seemed to have suffered this collective decline has been participation in the Jewish community centers. And while we don't have a YMHA in Hackensack anymore, we've got the beautiful JCC on the Palisades in Tenafly, New Jersey. But the level of participation in JCCs is at or near an all-time high. And the reasons I believe that it is because our expectations of people's participation are less than what they were expected to do in certain other frameworks. Their obligations were higher. The Jays have low barriers to entry. They have great diversity in the number of things that they can offer, and it's participation almost as you like it, but you also get exposed to a marketplace of opportunities that others had far more narrowly defined definitions of what participation was like. The other comment that I think it's important to make, and I will make this about the fundraising world and about the congregational world as well. When we began to see that participation levels were falling off, we tried to make it easier to participate. We began to relax our expectations or relax our standards so that denominational movements reduced the religious obligations, the observance obligations, to make it easier for people to come. And in the Federation world, if donors preferred not to give to the general campaign and they rather give to more designated beneficiaries, we found a way to enable them to participate in the way that they liked it. And notwithstanding the fact that we tried to make it more of what they told us they wanted, they elected to participate less and less as a result. Therefore, by making it accessible to the lowest common denominator of expectation, we made it less relevant altogether. So that rather than give people a reason not to leave, we need to be motivating and inspiring them to have a reason to come. That being part of a community, with whatever compromises that makes on us personally, provides us the richness of things that we can do collectively with and for one another that would be impossible to do in our greater isolation. And I think we saw quite a bit of that in the face of the pandemic, where we were compelled to not gather and be together in the ways that we had traditionally been, and we were drawn to find ways to come together to be supportive of one another. And again, of all the institutions on the organized landscape, the one that has been 100% back in-person business since pretty close to the beginning has been the JCC, which has provided critical services in childcare and social services and meal programs and a host of other things. So I'm contending with the question that the nature of what it means to be part of a community has changed by pushing on the subject that I believe is at the core, which is we need to raise our game as leaders in the Jewish community to help people to see that community participation is not transactional, it's opportunistic. That what we can do from being together allows us to experience personal identity in others in ways that we could never if we get to the point where we're writing our own narrative in the most narrowly defined terms.
I appreciate all of that context. I think the tension that I'm thinking about, and you'll help me understand the extent to which it plays into the JCC context, is precisely when you talk about your doors are more open, you're more adaptive by lowering the barriers of entry, there is less drop-off and more participation in the work of a JCC. And at the same time, as you say, lowering the barriers of entry, right, and is effectively also a form of saying it's harder for a community institution like a JCC to express core commitments, to make expectations, to make clear that there are either ideological expectations that come with a place like this, which I know is probably not a popular idea in the JCC system, but even like to articulate what is it that we're doing here beyond the pursuit of our own kind of self-interest that we are transactionally engaging with the JCC. So just as an analogy, I wrote a piece, about a month ago in a new journal that Hartman Institute has produced called Sources, called What Happened to Jewish Pluralism? That there was a rise of Jewish pluralism, institutions, a whole economy around Jewish pluralism in the 1980s and 1990s, and it is really threatened by the ideological climate that we're in. And I invited a response that's now on our website by Rabbi B'nai Lappi, who's the founder of Savara, the queer yeshiva in Chicago, a really remarkable and thriving institution. And her argument was basically, it's good that pluralistic institutions died because they invisibilized people like me, and we went out and started our own. And in other words, what she helped to illustrate is the difference between pluralist, or what we might call big tent institutions, and affinity institutions. In affinity institutions, both of these are types of community. In affinity institutions, I don't have to hide any portion of my identity. I don't have to try to get along with people who I don't like their choices or who I feel are invalidating my own, right? What she points out, which is something I alluded to in my critique, is that pluralistic institutions are sometimes cold because you're trying to reduce tensions between really strong affinities and hold big spaces. So it's great news, Doron, when JCC's enrollments are up, when they're providing essential services. But one of the questions that it creates is, what's the beating heart? Is it sufficient to be the place where a lot of people come together across difference, but don't actually bring those differences, those passions or their affinities to bear, because we don't want to argue in the pool, right? You know what I mean? So that's where I think that's, to me, where I find the interesting question for I don't know if JCCs all use the language of pluralism about their own identity, but by definition, creating a space that's big enough for everyone, which I think is a really huge moral value, runs up against the other need, which is the pursuit of affinity community.
Right. But in contrast, to those institutions in our community where people come to an institution, let's consider a synagogue, for example, for a common purpose, the breadth and scope of what a Jewish community center has to offer allows people to come to the community for a wide variety of purposes. And that the pluralism that you're alluding to is celebrated in the diversity of the kinds of activities that take place, and the fact that irrespective of your background, you come together within the context and framework of a JCC, because that's the place where the things that say unite us, but that define us as having something in common, create the setting within which we can engage in those things that may define us as more distinct. So there's an opportunity, in a way. I've come to really look at the JCCs as a Jewish community town square. It's a gateway to everything that the Jewish community has to offer, through which anybody from any background can find that path, find access to that resource. Many of those things we do within the framework of the JCC, but many more we do beyond the framework of the JCC, where the JCC are the saloon doors, which create opportunity to access and engage other players and participants in the community. And I actually think, in a way, while that was a very important and intentional momentum-driven part of our work, COVID-19 has created a great acceleration in that process, because the JCCs, by dint of the fact that their facilities were expansive and they had opportunities to enable people to utilize both indoor and outdoor and flexible spaces, and by the fact that the JCCs pulled together quickly to create health guidelines that allowed them to renew in-person operations within a safe and responsible approach in consultation with public health authorities, allowed the Jays to become very proactive partners with Jewish Federation, with Jewish day schools, to provide support for day school faculty, staff, and administrators that had to go back to in-person work on their own, with synagogues, with satellite facilities in the community where we could bring programs out to the community to make it more accessible at a time where they were more or less constrained, and where programs that we had traditionally run for seniors providing meals in the JCC on a regular basis became factories for producing meals that were delivered and brought to isolated seniors and others in the community for whom they had no access. All of this is by way of saying that we have seen and embraced a critical opportunity to be a facility for the wider community, and not simply a place that people from the wider community come for a narrow set of programs.
Let's talk a little bit, if we can, Doron, about the way. I'm very taken with the idea of a town square. One of the texts, for instance, that I've been playing with throughout the pandemic around community is a rabbinic Mishnaic text where the rabbis say a person can be compelled by the other members of a courtyard to participate in the costs of paying for the door for the courtyard and a gatehouse. In other words, text doesn't tell you anything about the benefits of membership, it implies them. If everybody has a gate and a courtyard, then a gate and whatever, a door, a gate, whatever it is, if everybody has that, everybody has security. The benefits are implied, but the obligations have to be stipulated. And the key idea is you can actually require people to build the town square together. So I guess there are two things that emerge from that. One is, if we're really talking about building a town square, what's the culture of obligation that we have to push back on and say, it's not just we over here are building the town square for you to participate in. All sorts of financial and inequity questions that come around who's building the town square and who's participating in it. Are we building genuinely constructed? And the second is, and this is the trick about community and boundaries, anytime you're building a community, if communities do have boundaries, as vastly open as you think a community is, you are probably drawing the boundary around somebody or something, sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously. In the Jewish community, as we know, the things that divide us right now tend to be less around denominational issues, right? Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews, that was a good fight in Sam Friedman's Jew versus Jew book of the 1980s and 1990s. It still pops up once in a while with an Eruv fight in some parts of America. It's not great here in Rockland County, a few miles from here, but it's not really the dividing issue. The dividing issues tend to be about politics, and in those, and sometimes about like invisible audiences who are viewed as like people don't quote unquote look Jewish, and therefore there are invisible boundaries to participation and belonging. And when it comes to politics, sometimes what we need people to do in order to come into big communal town square places is to be a little quieter, right? We need them to not make noise. You can be here in exchange for helping to prop this up and not make noise. But that's a hard ask for people for whom their politics are essential to their Jewishness. So even if we are succeeding, and I think what you're describing is the movement is succeeding, even if we're succeeding at creating these town squares, these gated courtyards, right? Those are very different metaphors for what it's worth. Even if we're succeeding, are we actually effectively requiring of a lot of people to not be in the town square the way they want to be? That's, I think, where it gets a little trickier around the construct of community and the question of what's working and what are the costs of even what's working.
Well, the question is whether or not within the square, we're providing people with an opportunity to assemble or gather or engage with other people who are like-minded, when potentially down the hall or across the way on the other side of the campus, there may be programs going on for a different subset of the community that's aligned around an activity or program or interest or a political point of view. And whether or not we're also viewing ourselves as the place in which responsible and informed debate on divided opinions has a place to be given expression. A little later on, we're going to have Zach Bodner, whom I know you know well, on a program that we're doing in our closing session today. And he'll relate a little bit to the work that he's done around Zionism 3.0, convening this town hall annual program on the very diverse views on the question of Israel-diaspora relations. And the JCC was the right place in the community for that conversation to take place because it doesn't have a particular point of view on the topic. But it was the place that everybody in the community felt they could come and bring their stuff, bring their point of view or perspective. And I know you've been out there on several occasions for these conferences.
Yeah, it's a great example because it illustrates the exact tension. This is something I've argued about with Zach for years. So I'm on the record. And even I'm going to argue about it with him now, not in his presence. And in fact, I even said it at the Zionism 3.0 conference when we did it in Los Angeles. In order to have a Zionism 3.0 conference, and it was an incredibly powerful thing to do at a JCC, 1,200 people coming together from across the community. I couldn't imagine any other institution pulling that off in the Bay Area. In order to do that, the Zionism 3.0 platform had to stipulate the ideological boundaries of inclusion. So in practice, it was a big tent that had poles. All big tents have poles. The thing is, though, big tent people don't like talking about the poles, because when you talk about the poles that hold up the tent, what you're really saying is that you're stipulating, even before you've had the conversation, who's in and who's out. But in practice, if you say, in order to be involved in a conversation about Zionism, you have to effectively agree about Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. You have to inherently value the Jewish sovereign and national project. You've already just decided who's in that conversation, who's out. And the minute you do that, Doron, the minute you do that, you have decided as your first act of convening big community that you're contracting community. It's your first act. And that's the paradox that we're in, which is you have to do it, right? Like any JCC, synagogue, Hillel that claims that they don't have boundaries for inclusion is lying. Of course they have boundaries of inclusion. Some are honest and they tell you up front what they are, and some aren't and they're masked. And sometimes it's more painful when you stipulate them up front because people feel excluded. And sometimes it's more painful when you don't stipulate them because then people think that they're included and find out the wrong way that they're not. But I think anytime we position ourselves and our institutions as generally being open as the town square, we have to know that we're also in the tent building business.
I'm enjoying this so much that I'm reluctant to share the conversation with our colleagues, but I'm told that we've got a bunch of things queued up. Before I turn to Sam and we open up for the questions, though, I do want to say that I think Jewish life is aspirational. And I think as a result of that, we want, if we're going to be in leadership, intellectual leadership, institutional leadership, moral leadership, whatever you want to call it, if we're going to be in leadership in the Jewish community, then we have to provide a target to shoot for as a community, an aspiration to which to aspire. That doesn't by definition mean that people have to be intentionally left out, but it does mean that we're either going to bring people to some sort of a collective view or will or direction, or we're not going to. I think the issue, just coming back to the last point that you were raising, and we're going to use Zach and Zionism 3.0 as an example. The invitation was wide open to people to come into that conversation, and we knew that there would be people for whom Israel is not necessarily an ideal or an attraction or an appeal, but by participating, they would be exposed to voices and perspectives that might broaden their consideration and allow them to be engaged in the debate. Beyond that, people will opt out, and people will always opt out. And I guess the beauty of community and of individuality is that we are participating by choice. The question as leaders is, can we inspire or motivate people to choose to be part, to bring voice and perspective and input into the collective conversation, and at the same time draw from the collective the power and strength that comes from common history, common tradition, and a common path that we share, whether we believe we share it or not. History tells us that we are on a common road. I think with that, again, I'm over utilizing my privilege as the moderator of the session. Sam, let me turn things over to you and to our esteemed group.
Great, thanks, Doron. I'm just going to be sharing some questions that have come in through the chat. So although they'll make me sound very smart, they're not my own thoughts. They're some of our wonderful participants' thoughts. So the first question is really going back, Yehuda, to your opening comments. We had a question around this concept of obligation to belong to community, and whether you have any more insights onto what perhaps motivates people today in that obligation.
So I mean, one of my favorite texts on this is Maimonides writes that a person who celebrates Jewish holidays, who never commits any infractions or transgressions, but who celebrates their Judaism without on their own, without participating in what he calls the feasts and the fasts, the celebrations and the tragedies, is basically, he describes them as basically, I think he says, lose their share in the world to come. But what he's really saying is it's kind of a tautology. If you don't participate in Jewish communal life, you don't get to participate in Jewish communal life. And what I like about it is he starts with the pious person who's actually, it's easy to start with the impious person, but a person who's doing everything Jewishly, but is doing it outside of the framework of community is just not doing it right. I think I want to make an unsustainable statement, which I can say because I'm not actually a sociologist. I don't think most Jews are doing that with their Judaism. I think most Jews may have an idiosyncratic sense of what they want to do Jewishly, but they absolutely want other Jews to do it together with. They're in the hunt for community. And that's because, as I said, I don't think the anthropological sense that we don't want to live isolated Jewish lives has really changed. I think to notice, for instance, the kind of questions I want to find out from this past year is, how did Jews find a way of doing Jewish with other Jews in a time when they couldn't? Not did they, how did they? Zoom turned out to be an extraordinary community builder. People were reaching out to each other. Ironically, it could have been, each of us are on our own screens, and therefore it has an atomizing, individualizing quality. But in reality, I want to look appreciatively for the ways we were all reaching out to each other in order to constitute community during an impossible time. That, I feel, is going to have enormous lessons for us anthropologically about that desperation. Why was that so important to us? What do we see from that? And what then, and again, then we can extrapolate outwards. What does that mean for our communities when they see themselves as responsible for facilitating and constructing community? It'll be a huge leg up in that process when we can actually learn from this deep human need that was expressed and articulated during this impossible time.
Thank you.
It's notable at this stage that we're still in the learning process because we haven't reached the end, though it feels like we're getting closer. We're certainly not there yet. So there's still a great deal to interpret and a requirement to be patient before we think we truly understand what's come out of this whole period. Mm-hmm. Sam, we have another question?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you talked about the different models of community early on in your remarks, and you said, one model could be that community is built, we're building community to market it, we're marketing it. And on the other hand, another model could be that we co-create, we have a space and we open up that space and we co-create with community. When can you sort of talk a little bit about how we could embrace the idea of leading in building community in that marketing and the ideas that behind that marketing, and when we can also at the same time build co-create, can we do both is the question. And can you talk a little bit about how we could see co-creating as an and, not an or proposition?
It's a great question. I try to stay in my line of work in the why business as opposed to the how business. So you'll forgive me if I don't engage the question of how can we do this, as much as where I see these pulling apart from each other. And again, it's sometimes Hillels or JCCs or other community institutions where the effectiveness of the marketing of something extraordinary, this amazing lecture series, is a means of saying what our job is to entice you in with something that we know that you want, which is really different than here our environment is a blank slate for you to participate in helping to shape it. I don't think, I'm sure most institutions live somewhere in between those places, right? Obviously your programming is going to be shaped by your lay leadership, your volunteers, by market conditions, all sorts of things. So I don't know the answer of how to do both of that. The model I'm intrigued by, which I don't think has fully played out at the adult level, is that this is what Hillels are designed to do for college students ages 18 to 22. They are designed to be blank slate institutions of Jewish life for a group of people who will only be tenants in that institution for a very short tenure. And they have to develop a weird habit of being prepared to be, in a lot of ways, totally different institutions every 5 years because they have a totally different constituency. Incidentally, their challenge is that they're oftentimes caught between what their students on campus want and what their stakeholders want. And they are the only local Jewish institutions on the national level, local institutions whose primary funding constituency is not local. It's like a weird paradox. So they're often caught there. I just think, what does that feel? What might that feel like for Jewish adults to feel like when they walk into or participate in the local Jewish community centers where they're there, where they live, that there's some measure of a blank slate for them not simply to be clients, but to be co-designers?
It's an interesting, it's an interesting question. And the Hillel analogy is an interesting one as well. I think we often talk about Hillel as the JCC of the university campus. The distinction, of course, with us is that we've got a whole lifetime of different demographics to contend with. So it's not a reinvention so much as it has to be part of an evolution, a renewal that comes with the evolving nature of the populations that we have. I think also the framework of the conversation we've been having have been about individual programs, but I hasten to remind all of us, I guess, or maybe I'm just reminding myself, that we are the largest provider of Jewish early childhood education programs on the continent with 30,000 children. We're the largest provider of summer camp programs on the continent with 100,000 campers and staff. We're the largest employer on the continent with something north of 30,000 full and part-time employees year-round. So the ability to create and to define what can be normative in a broad tent approach to the engagement with the Jewish community is a unique responsibility of JCCs.
Yeah.
Sam, next question.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a request if you could just talk a little bit in the framing of some of your remarks in terms of identifying factors by generation. So in the beginning, when you were talking about coming out of the pandemic and what we should be thinking about, in particular with regards to millennials who are now parents, and also in regards to sort of maybe Gen Y and Gen Z who are our future.
Well, I don't know, but I will say, part of what I was trying to talk about with, like, for instance, political progressive behavior among Gen Z and millennials is that I think more of it is traditional in terms of the search for community than it is oftentimes portrayed. I think that that's I really think is a misunderstanding by the organized Jewish community that thinks that what's going on with significant political organizing is somehow a rebellion against belonging to Jewish community. It's oftentimes an indictment of what people feel are the normative values of Jewish community, but it is in many cases, it behaves as though a community organizing activity. And that's what, again, I want to challenge us to not think that the next generation of Jewish life is behaving differently around community than the foregoing generation of Jewish life because they're doing something wrong. I think part of the reason, so I had a moment when I was in my early 20s, and my wife and I had moved from New York to Boston. And, classic story, we didn't like this shul and we didn't like the other shul. The classic story would have been we never would have stepped foot in a synagogue for 20 years, but fine. But we were going to belong to a synagogue. We didn't like this one, we didn't like the other one. So what do? We started our own. And we got a lot of guilt. Obviously, you got a lot of guilt. It's an anti-communitarian activity. We're like, it's not anti-communitarian. We want to build a community, right? It's just, I don't like the models that are currently been created for us. And I did have pause, right? I had pause of, am I doing something that violates what you're supposed to do as a Jewish citizen, which is sign up for, belong, pay dues, and be miserable at the Jewish institutions that are in your neighborhood. That's what you're supposed to do. And I realized as I was processing this, my grandfather, my grandmother, both of blessed memory, were part of the founding group of the Yeshiva of Flatbush in Brooklyn. I don't think they sat around and said, oh man, we can't start this school because there's another school that we don't want to send our kids to and that we're obligated to. In other words, the processes of building new community institutions is not stagnant. It's a sine curve. And sometimes what it means to belong in Jewish life is to belong to the institutions that exist. And sometimes what it means to belong to Jewish life is to create institutions that you can belong to. And I think it's just the generational discomfort is that the generation of people who were fine with belonging to the institutions that worked for them look at a next generation saying we need a new set of institutions, and they view them as ungrateful instead of viewing them as you need to find the relationship to the institutions that you can create that matches in its fulfillment the experience that we had in our own time.
I think the question, though, that at least stays with me, Yehuda, on that topic is that with ensuing generations perhaps feeling less anchored or eager to create their new means or mechanisms within the community than those that came before them, they participate in a drift beyond the boundaries of community. So it's one thing to say we didn't like the day school in the neighborhood, so we made a new one, or you wanted to create a new synagogue. I think we all look with some trepidation on an emerging generation that wants not to do what they want to do within the community. That's not to say broadly, and that's a terrible generalization because there are many that do. But as we look at the marginally engaged in Jewish life, and again, this enormous asset of the JCCs is that we have direct access to the largest concentric circle of those that are marginally engaged and have not yet drifted away. How do we make sure that their visionary evolution of what they want to see happen remains within the framework of the Jewish community in a way that passes the baton from one generation to the next, as opposed to allowing them to slip through our grasp to the point where we have a difficult time finding and engaging them for continued involvement and participation in the community.
Yeah, I don't think I'm disagreeing with you, Doron, but the one place I would push back is, and it emerged in the chat, a few people mentioned that, that there are communities like LGBTQ Jews and Jews of color who feel much less included in our community institutions than we think. Yeah. Even when we're being sincere about including them, they feel less included. And part of that is that whole frame. The minute that it's our institution and we're exercising some version of inclusion of you've already signaled you're a guest and I'm a host. And moving that mindset is really hard. And it's really hard to say, if you want people to be engaged in your institutions and you want to give it over to them, to actually give it over and say, we want you in this institution, not just because you belong here as clients and guests and stakeholders, but because we're willing to actually hand you the keys. And that's where, and the fact is that some of the most powerful community organizing over the past generation in the Jewish community has been by Jews of color for communities of Jews of color, and certainly by LGBT Jews who are finding community for themselves. So what would it look like to really say, we want you part of the Jewish community. We can't create the structures ourselves, right? To make you part of this Jewish community. You're going to be the ones who do it. And here are the keys. Not just here's the welcome mat, but here are the keys.
Terrific. Sam, I see we've got a few minutes left. We're in your hands here.
Okay, so I will bring one more question and then I think it will be time to wrap. Doron, when you were talking a little bit earlier in some of your remarks about talking about barriers to entry, and that in the JCC world, we've seen that it's made it easier for people to join, easier to participate, and we've seen that increasing in participation. But in contrast, in other areas of organized Jewish life, like the federation system and synagogues, where those obligations have been reduced, we've heard that hasn't necessarily been as successful. I just wanted to that question came up as, have you got anything additional to add there on perhaps why that might be the case?
Well, look, I think at the end of the day, we have an inclination, a reflexive inclination, those of us in leadership in the Jewish community, to give our constituents or our target audience what it is that we believe they want. And to try as best as we can to rise to their expectations or to meet their expectations. In its own strange way, that's tantamount to our saying we'd like to become the perfect reflection of our constituents. This is what we're hearing from them. This is what we are seeing from them. Therefore, let's deliver it in the way that they want. And I think that there is a fundamental distinction between having something to sell from a market that wants to buy and feeling responsible in a leadership capacity for taking a community to a place other than where it is. If you meet them only where they are, then you're not moving anywhere. So the question is, do we aspire to be a perfect reflection, or do we see ourselves as shepherds with responsibility to lead, giving the community something that it didn't know that it wanted, but that it ultimately comes to believe that it needs? And that's how we evolve, that's how we guide, that's how we take the community forward. And I think that that's a contrast. I also think that because we're all so dependent on fundraising these days, we have to be malleable to give the funder, the donor, the revenue provider the thing that they want in the way that they want it, and that compromises our ability to be shepherds in the way that we need. But in my view, if there's going to be a greater future for the Jewish community, we're going to have to rise to the occasion as shepherds. Yehuda, let me give you the last word, and then I'll do a couple of closing housekeeping items.
So I really appreciate this conversation and the dialogue, Doron, with you and with your colleagues. I will say we didn't get to talk about this much, but just as a teaser, the other major referenda, I think, for us about the pandemic were about the quality of our leaders on a local, communal, national level. I think it's just a what to watch for. We learned the difference between what it means to have competent leadership in our institutions and in our country, and we also witness a referendum on the quality of our democracy, and it's not a coincidence that happened during the past year. And I really am interested in exploring even institutions that are apolitical. What does it mean for them to be contributing on the landscape of the quality of American democracy? Not just because that's what Jews are thinking and talking about, but because we can't actually thrive as American Jews in our micro communities without participating in the larger culture of democracy that's around us. We are inseparable from the landscape. So I think those are just two last comments that if we had more time, we could dig into more.
I would have loved that, and we'll love that. I think when we reflect back on this crisis as we have with others, we tend to look at them in a vacuum. But there will be no interpreting this pandemic without interpreting it against the backdrop of what was happening societally and politically here. They are tightly woven together, and those of us, therefore, with responsibility for community have to be far more discerning interpreters of what we've seen and experienced. I want to say on behalf of the entire group that was gathered today, and I think the many that will have a chance to watch this session moving forward, we're deeply grateful, Yehuda, for helping us to think and interpret and assess more broadly some of the major challenges that we're facing. And we are very lucky to have you at the helm of the Shalom Hartman Institute and to have you as a voice that we can turn to over and over again. And we will certainly be looking forward to doing just that at the next opportunity. In the meantime, I want to thank everybody who came to join us today in this session. I want to remind you how honored and grateful we are at JCC Association to have been able to offer this conference to all of our JCCs. at no cost, thanks to the magnanimous support of our generous ProCon 2021 sponsors. You will find them in the virtual vendor hall just after this session is over, between 1:45 and 2:45. And I hope you'll take some time to go and say hello. Lots of interesting initiatives and very important partners who are clearly inclined to invest in the work that we do. They will be waiting to welcome you. And finally, I would urge you all to join us again at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific for the closing movement moment of ProCon 2021. Thank you all again for being with us. We'll see you around the virtual halls.